Okay. So I'm going to shift to education. But like I say, you covered education.
Yeah, you know.
So I know you were not a journalist at the time, but do you remember the relay program the school district implemented to alleviate overcrowding in predominantly black schools?
Yeah, I lived in Cleveland, although I was not working as a journalist at that point. Yeah, the Huff neighborhood changed rapidly from a white neighborhood to a black neighborhood as with the First World War II and then the Korean War. The factories were hiring everybody they could. People were streaming in from the South, and the housing segregation was so rigid that people were jammed in on top of each other in the housing. In big houses were cut up into apartments where families were living just in these under these horrible conditions, sharing bathroom and kitchen and that kind of thing. But Huff was very crowded. Plus, another thing about the Huff area was it had been had a lot of Eastern European population before they moved out as the black people moved in, and they were Catholic, and so there were not a lot of public schools for the number of students there because the Catholic school system absorbed a lot of them. So when the black people came in, who of course were not Catholic, and they were send their kids to public schools, the schools were incredibly overcrowded, and the school board. Well, what the school board faced, they could have bused the children, which parents were demanding, bus them to other neighborhoods where the schools did have adequate room. There were underused schools, and they could have absorbed the students just by changing the boundary lines for the school districts. Those boundary lines were adhered to very rigidly. Uh, they didn't even have to, some of them, some of the overcrowding could have been alleviated simply by just changing the lines and having the kids walk to school, even without any busing. But the school board wouldn't do that. The school board was almost entirely white elected, and I imagine every board member felt if they voted for it, they wouldn't get elected again. But instead, the board started renting space in churches nearby in Huff, and finally they decided that the only way to accommodate all of the kids who were flooding into the public schools there was to have what they called relay classes. Half the school would start very early in the morning and have a shortened school day. And then when they left, then the second shift of kids would come in. So these relay classes meant that the kids on neither shift got a full day of school like they were getting in other neighborhoods. And the parents mobilized and organized and demanded that there be open up these schools nearby in the white neighborhoods to these kids, and the board resisted 100%. So there was that tension. The entire community, the black community, was involved in fighting it. The NAACP eventually started playing a leadership role in demanding change, and finally the board was forced to relent, and if I remember that right, they did begin taking black children to white neighborhoods where there was room in the school buildings for them. But they first started what they called intact busing. These kids would come in as outsiders. They would come in on the buses. They would go into their segregated classrooms for the Huff kids, and they were not a part of the school. They were simply being accommodated so that they could have a full day of school, but they were not integrated into the school. It wasn't one school anymore. So that intact busing was tried for a while. The school board also launched a program, a rapid program of building new schools and in the black neighborhoods. And what they would do was, of course, each school had a playground and all. And what they did in some cases was simply eliminate the playground and build a new school on the playground so that you'd have two schools on one campus. But they did that rather than allow the black children to go into white neighborhoods and be a part of those schools. So there just were many devices that the school board used to maintain segregation. There were protests against this building two schools on one site and eliminating any playground for the kids in the process. And of course, at the on Lakeview Road, where they were building a new school, there were protests, and this I'm talking now, what's that, 1964, I guess it was. And there were protests trying to stop the construction. And at one of the protests, the protesters laid down in a ditch to stop the earth, the big tractor from operating. They laid down in front of the tractor, and a minister, Bruce Clunder, a white minister who was supporting the black protest, he laid down in back of the tractor. And apparently the tractor driver did not know he was there. He backed up the tractor and ran over him. And the picture of his body with the tractor tracks running over it was the national news picture that for Cleveland. But anyway, the school system did go ahead and maintain their construction project that minimized racial integration. And that, of course, there were lawsuits filed, but the big lawsuit that was filed then by the national NAACP against the Cleveland School Board in the early 1970s finally did lead to crosstown busing and all.
Okay.
But let me say this: the mobilization around the half-day schools for black kids in Huff and the other things, and the segregated schools, the mobilization in the community would energize the community so much that I think it played a very big role in the eventual election of Carl Stokes as mayor. If there hadn't been the community organization built around the school protests, then I don't think that the turnout would have been enough to elect Carl Stokes in 1967. So all of one thing flowed into another.
I was wondering, is there any data on what happened to the kids who only received a half day of education?
What happened to education? I mean,
Like the kids, anybody know what happened
after the busing started, you mean, or what?
Pretty much like their unequal education they got at this district.
Well, was there evidence of unequal education?
No, the evidence of the outcomes of their education.
Well, the outcome of education certainly deteriorated. There was inequality all along in the system. That was part of the reason for maintaining the segregation. While it wasn't the kind of stark inequality that you could find anywhere. And some of the best schools and the best education in Cleveland was in the high-end black schools. But at the same time, there was a great deal of discrimination and ignoring, especially in the lower income neighborhoods of black schools. The black kids were not getting necessarily what their counterparts in white neighborhoods were getting. There was a lot of that evidence brought out eventually. I know in one school, and this goes way back to the 1940s, where it was a black school, white principal, very, very few black principals at that time. And a second grade girl's mother was looking at her textbook. One of her friends came over, the mother's friends came over, saw the textbook that her daughter had for the second grade, and she said, oh, my daughter had that in the first grade. And so the mother went and looked and investigated, and sure enough, in this black school, they were holding the kids back a year. They were pretending that they were learning and being promoted, but the curriculum held them back. It turned out the principal just didn't believe black kids learned that fast. And the rules were changed. I know in the 50s, one of the teachers was telling me that at East Tech High School, when it became overwhelmingly black school, one day the principal had an assembly and announced that he had good news for the kids, that they decided instead of needing 3 units of English to graduate, they only need 2. Well, the kids were wild with ecstasy. They weren't going to have to work as hard. And the teacher told me how she had to explain to them what had just been done to them. They were downgrading the curriculum so that the outcome would not prepare the kids as well as they should have been prepared and were being prepared in other schools in the city. And then finally, in the 70s or early 80s, when busing actually started, it was discovered so many of the black schools were in very bad repair, much worse than in the white school. And when they were suddenly going to be integrated, there was this massive effort to repair the schools. I know I knew a white principal on the west side, a high school principal, who was switched to a black school on the east side, and he was appalled at the lack of equipment and supplies in the black school. It just didn't happen in his school. So there were this kind of discrimination, but obviously when you don't have as rigorous a curriculum and you don't have the resources that kids need, they're not going to do as well as they would if they had everything. But as I say, that was not universal. There were anyone who wanted to defend the system could cherry pick a multitude of examples of excellence in the black schools that would seem to belie what happened. But if you look overall, yes, there was the discrimination.
Okay. Okay, I did want to know, but the school segregation remains. So how would you describe Briggs as a person and his views on immigration?
Well, after, I told you about the minister, Reverend Bruce Clunder, who was run over by the tractor, killed the demonstration, and how devastating that was. And finally, I guess the business community, powers be, realized something had to be done in Cleveland. Prior to that happening, the superintendents were always promoted from within, and they were always brought the same culture and same perspective as their predecessors. And it seems finally the city realized that something dramatic had to happen. So for the first time, they went outside the system to bring in a new superintendent, and that was Paul Briggs. He was from Michigan, and then he was a superintendent in Ohio and in the suburb of Parma, which was growing rapidly. And so he was building schools left and right there. And he looked like the ideal person to come into Cleveland and really get things straightened out. So he came to Cleveland, and I eventually got to know the man fairly well. I would say he did not set records any great shakes as an educator. He may have been a good educator, I don't know, but he was known for building, and he immediately came in and got a new levy passed or bond issue passed to build the biggest building program in the history of the city. And he was building schools left and right. He also understood that he had to involve the Black community in ways that had never been done before. So he appointed some extremely talented Black people, or teachers, principals. He appointed them some to his cabinet and built up a cabinet that, I've heard from the education community, was kind of the envy of the country, as good as any in the country of talented people, Black and white, in his cabinet. And there was a lot of change, at least on the surface. Incidentally, one thing that Paul Briggs did that I think had to be a masterstroke, although I never heard him or anyone else explain it this way, but the NAACP had been a leader of the protests against the discrimination in the schools at the time he came. And the president of the NAACP at that time, Reverend Donald Jacobs, was pastor of an AME church here in Cleveland. So it may have been sheer coincidence, and it may have been extreme political insight on the part of Briggs, but at least two of the members of Reverend Jacobs' congregation were also PhDs in education, who were doing outstanding jobs in the school system. And he brought them downtown into his cabinet right away. Well, whether he planned it that way or not, the fact is that having two of the top people in his system, also members of the church headed by the president of the NAACP, probably made communications a lot easier, if nothing else. But in fact, what I would say in all my years of reporting, one of the best politicians I ever saw, I came to think, even though he never ran for office, was Paul Briggs. He seemed to sense how you avoid problems and how you solve them, and if you don't solve them, you at least hide them. But he just seemed to have that knack to navigate the political forces and the intense racial tensions, in Cleveland. And so he did quite well at that, and he was kind of everybody's champion, or most people's champion, not everyone. Some were highly critical of him because the schools really weren't getting better. But he did well until the national NAACP came in and actually sued based on all the discrimination that had been built into the system throughout the years and was still functioning within the system. And Briggs fought it, and I think then he kind of lost his mojo, and things fell apart on it.
How different was he from McAllister?
I'm sorry,
How different was he from McAllister, the former superintendent?
Oh, no, McAllister was not a superintendent. Ralph McAllister was president of the school board, lawyer, and he was the president who was very outspoken in defending the system as it was, and he was really hostile toward the people demanding change, and he was a big part of the problem that I was describing in the early days. He was held up as the villain. The superintendent before Briggs was not vilified that much. He was more of a mild-mannered school superintendent. He was not a politician, and he was not a community leader. He was a technician. So, but the image that people looked at when they looked at the school board and figuratively wanted to throw darts at it was Ralph McAllister, who knew how to stir people up.
Okay. What was the culture of the school board in terms of like racial attitudes? I mean, was it city? Are they elected by wards or city?
How did the school board? How
What
was
was
it
like their
governed?
attitudes about? What was their attitudes about race in terms of the
Oh,
school board?
attitudes
Yeah, by members of the school board.
from the school board itself.
Mhm.
Okay, well, school board at that time had 7 members elected at large throughout the city. And say in 1960, I think there was 1, maybe 2 school board members were black, but they were kind of handpicked by the community as a whole. They were inoffensive when it came to the issues. They were not outspoken. They were accepted as tokens given to the black community so they'd have black faces up there. Not to say they weren't good people by doing what they could, but they weren't in an environment where militancy and bedrock demands was going to work at all. So the school board had a white majority throughout most of this period up until the desegregation suit after it was settled. And as the question of desegregation came up, the white community had one concern, which was that there not be any busing. That we don't bring people outside our community into our schools, don't send our kids across town. And the national NAACP felt that because of the ingrained racism and all that was in the system, that it was absolutely necessary to physically have kids of different races in the same classes in order to fight. But there was no way in the world that the white community would accept busing. So the school board members had to go back to their base in order to get elected. And since everybody was elected citywide, and at the time the majority of the voters were white, no matter what people felt privately among themselves, they had to hold the line. If that answers your question, I don't know.
Oh, okay. No, it does. This one, so busing occurred in Cleveland pretty late, and ultimately wasn't as successful since white families began withdrawing their children from city schools or moved to the suburbs. Yeah, can you talk about busing and the desegregation of Cleveland public schools?
Yeah, busing became the issue. I knew that when the school board, let me say before I'm speaking with such confidence on it. At the time that the national NAACP decided to come into Cleveland, they had, of course, won the big decision against segregation in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which pretty much ended Jim Crow in America, or launched the end of Jim Crow. And then they turned their efforts toward the various northern cities where the segregation and all was subtle and was not legal, and it was not formal Jim Crow, but to a large extent had the same effect. And so they wanted to tackle that. And as I said earlier, their belief was that it probably is so entrenched that the only way in which they can really root out racism is to have people bussed and brought together. And as I say, that was the one thing that nobody could sell to, at least in the white, the black community would accept it whether they wanted it or not, but it would not be accepted in the white community. So, what was the question again? I forget where I was going.
Oh yeah, I just read about the busing and desegregation.
Oh, what just generally what happened?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the racism was so pervasive and so historic within the system. It was a slam dunk case, I would say. I mean, the NAACP had top first class lawyers. When I say slam dunk, I don't mean just any lawyer come off the street and win it, but doing the job right, assembling the information correctly, knowing what to look for. They would find it. And when they brought it into court, in any fair court of law, the ruling would have to be that, yes, the Cleveland schools did practice racial discrimination. So they began the effort. They filed the case. They went through the various legal steps that they had to go through, and meanwhile they were compiling all this information, and they knew what to look for. In fact, what one of the people involved in the case told me, that in their experience they had compiled a list of about 13 different ways that various school boards may use to practice racial discrimination. And in every city they went into, there would be some of these practices that were on their list of 13 ways. Some of these practices, they knew they'd find them. Cleveland, they said, was the first city they ever went into where they found all 13 were being done in one way or another, in terms of assigning teachers or equipment or curriculum, whatever. But they found that that Cleveland clearly was in effect a racially discriminatory school system. Well, it's fine, but the Cleveland School Board resisted, even though they knew the NAACP was right. They had to fight it in court, and the reason they had to fight it was nobody could be elected to the school board who accepted the change that would involve busing. And yet they knew that the solution was going to lead to busing. So anyway, they fought it first in the district court and then in the Court of Appeals, and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, I'll tell you something that is little known, but I think it was after they had gotten the ruling from the district court that yes, indeed, Cleveland had practiced discrimination, and the school board then appealed the Court of Appeals. They secretly sent word. They couldn't do this directly at all, but in a very roundabout way, they sent word to the lawyers for the NAACP that if the NAACP would accept a solution that did not involve any busing, Cleveland would stop opposing the suit and accept the responsibility for all the discrimination that was alleged. That was the only reason they were fighting it, was to prevent busing, because politically they'd be dead if they didn't. So the NAACP rejected that. Or the fact, what I was going to say, not only would they accept responsibility, but the NAACP then would be in a position to really spell out everything that needed to be changed and needed to be done. The school board would not fight them in simply redeveloping the system any way that it had to be redeveloped. It sounded, to me like this was an opportunity to develop a major northern city school system that is designed to meet the needs of the Black children. This would have been the first, I think, in the country anywhere that happened. But the NAACP said that they couldn't do that because that wouldn't work. They had to have busing included in the remedy. And so they went on to the Supreme Court. The Cleveland system, of course, lost in every court, at every level. So at least they could say, well, we tried and we fought it all the way. It turned out, however, my feelings about it, I was covering the schools for the paper, and my feeling was that by filing the case, which would automatically lead to busing, what's going to happen in the community, no matter how right the NAACP position is legally and morally, what's going to happen in the community, there will be no more demand for quality education, and busing would become the sole issue when it comes to Cleveland schools. All the energy would be sucked up in the fight over busing. And there would be no more energy that was out there before saying, we need this in our curriculum, we need to change things, we need to improve the schools. Busing would become the answer. And I remember talking to one of my friends who was very much involved in the fight with the NAACP in this fight. I remember saying to him, what's going to happen is that it's not going to aid, it couldn't possibly aid the education of the children if nobody is paying any attention to education anymore. I hate to say it, even though I was never an educator, but I just lived in the community, and that's the way I think it turned out. Mm-hmm. There was the desegregation was ordered, the school bureaucracy resisted it at every point. And when they were told they had to develop these new plans of transportation and all, they botched them. They didn't do a good job. So the judge then had to appoint outsiders to take over the school system and develop the plans to make them work. But the outsiders could only come in and do what they work theoretically. They weren't, a part of the system. The people who were in the system, or as I say, were not going to help them in any way. And so we wound up with busing, but we also wound up with a loss of emphasis on education and quality. That's not the NAACP's fault. That's the fault of the community having those values. But at the same time, I thought it was inevitable that's the way it was going to turn out. Unfortunately, things did not get better after the desegregation started. I'm not saying that the desegregation caused the decline of schools, in that there was maybe nothing really wrong with the desegregation plan if people had wanted it to work. But all the authorities could do was have the plan. They couldn't make people make it work. That was my reaction to it.
Yeah. Okay. So how early did some white families start withdrawing their kids from? How soon did white families start withdrawing their kids from the public schools?
How soon did
When did that start in Cleveland?
Well, that was in motion from the 1950s. The percentage of black to white kept changing. The percentage of whites in the school system was declining. The percentage of blacks in the school system was growing gradually for decades, I guess. But when the actual desegregation started in late 70s, early 80s, I think, that's when there was a massive pulling out. Although the pulling out of the school system was not just white, it's called white flight and all that, and I think that's a term that is not precise enough to explain, to give understanding of what really happened. You had the families that had options decided they didn't want to leave their kids in this turmoil. And so it was not only white families that either moved to the suburbs or found private schools for their kids, but your middle class black families also moved to the suburbs or found some alternative, so that this turmoil that came along with the busing would not be their problem. So rather than white flight, as I say, the options flight, the people who had a choice, many of them pulled out of the system. Some stayed, and some of the kids did very well. It wasn't a disaster for everybody. I certainly don't want to imply that, but things did not go as well or as smoothly as one would wish they had gone. Mm-hmm. But the change, by the people with options pulling out, that left a greater concentration of lower income families, and that, of course, meant a greater concentration of black families as well as low income whites and the growing Puerto Rican population. But that happened pretty rapidly. I think it's my sense, and I can't give you the figures on this, but my sense is it started once the suit was filed. I think people started looking for options. We had the choice. Change actually was taking place. A lot of people were gone, and a lot more, accelerated the leaving the system. And of course, both the city and the schools were declining in number anyway. The industrial age was over. So for a host of reasons, things were going down in Cleveland. But yeah, there was a lot of movement after busing started, as there had been before it started or before it was even talked about.
All right. So another question I have on education. So, do you remember the various race riots at Collinwood High School in the 60s and 70s, and what made that neighborhood so unique to have constant racial turmoil?
Yeah, Collinwood High School, as I understand it, there were problems. There always were problems there up into the 70s. The neighborhood, of course, back in the 40s, 50s, white neighborhood, there was a small pocket a small black community in Collinwood, and the kids from that small area were a very small minority in the student body. But I had always heard that when in the 60s, that sometimes on the spring day, it's kind of a rite of spring, that the white kids would jump on the black kids, and they would just get beaten one day. And as the black population in the 60s started increasing, they were better able to fight back. And I know about 1964 or 63, something like that, the early 60s, there was one big outburst where there was these whites who wanted to fight, were something set them off that day, and they jumped on the black kid. There were enough black kids to fight back, and they all went to the cafeteria and broke up the furniture to use as clubs to defend themselves. And the football coach managed to get the football team, to line up and make a safe corridor out of the school for the kids, and they got on buses and were bussed away from the area. But that was something of a rite of spring that I think happened at Collinwood almost every year, or very frequently. But what started happening in the late 60s, as the black population got larger, it was no longer just about the black kids beating up, but there were real fights, it was a real battle. And I remember going out there as a reporter in the late 60s and in the early 70s. There'd be one day when the fight was on at Collinwood, and by that time the police would come and separate the kids, and they would have to close the school, but at least the real damage and injuries didn't take place as much, because the cops knew they had to separate. But yeah, that went on until finally I imagine the black population got so large that it didn't pay to pick the fights anymore, and it something that faded away.
Were there other schools that you reported on that had like social unrest? I know John F. Kennedy, there was a major walkout from a teacher who was a black nationalist, and she was transferred. Anita Oaktree.
Oh, yeah, I think she taught at
East
High School.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, she was a very dynamic young lady, I guess, and a black nationalist at a time when this was not acceptable yet. What she wanted to teach the kids, I imagine, would have been considered acceptable 10 years later, but back around the late 60s or early 70s, she was trying to talk about this stuff, and I don't know if she was doing it well, and I don't know if she was doing it appropriately, because as I recall, she was a science teacher, biology,
Mm-hmm.
but somehow taking up the science class with topics far afield. Anyway, she was told not to do it, and she continued to, and they disciplined her, wanted to move her out, and a lot of the kids rebelled. I don't remember too much about it, but there was some uprisings at the school. I think they had to close the school. I don't remember East High. But they might have had to close it temporarily or for a date or something. But the kids were ready to do battle. They were full of vinegar and all, and they got riled up and protested. That's what I'm trying to say there.
Mm-hmm.
So that happened, but I don't remember much about that particular case, I'd have to look it up again.
There's a lot of cases. Yeah. East Technical High School, I think Mayor Carl Stokes had to send some policemen there. The teachers protesting against security, or protested for security or physical safety. But there was so much going on.
Yeah. Yeah, Cleveland was an interesting place to be a reporter back then.
In the high school protest, it was alleged that black nationalists were behind, like John Hay.
Yeah, the John Hay.
You covered, I know. I saw you covered that story.
Yeah, what happened was, of course, with all the things that have been going on in the 60s, the town was in, there was an attitude of ferment. It was, people wanted to do things. Young people wanted to march. They wanted to demonstrate. They wanted to be involved in things. I would compare it to maybe, in a sense, to what the nation saw in starting in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. That video of that murder went on for 9 minutes, and it was so powerful that you've just seen a lot of ferment going on. Starting, there were more marches and demonstrations and all in 2020 on, as a result of the George Floyd and the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. Well, that kind of was what we saw in was happening in Cleveland. First of all, you had the excitement of the election of Carl Stokes. You had cities burning across the country prior to that. And you had this mood of action, of energy, of people being frustrated, wanting things, wanting to move. When I watched the George Floyd tape, the video, I remember thinking, we're going to have a lot of turmoil. I knew that immediately because I had seen what happened back in the 60s, that even though the specific case, the specific incident may be settled, may be all over, the juices that are flowing, the emotions that are stirred, they last for a while. And generally, the people are going to be different for a generation in some ways. The young people who witness these things are going to be a little bit different because of what they've witnessed. So I wasn't surprised by all the marches and everything. I was, in a way, I was surprised that they were sustained as long as they have been. But at the same time, I knew that it was going to be a very tumultuous summer, tumultuous year as a result of the emotions involved. Well, that was kind of what was where Cleveland was in the late 1960s. So at John Hay High School, had a student there. He was a member of one of these groups who were always talking about, we got to confront the man, we're going to have the revolution, or whatever it was they were planning. They were talking about, not planning, but just talking about, had all this emotional stuff going on. He came to the school wearing the dashiki, which, that was so revolutionary back in 1968. And the schools had a dress policy and all that kind of thing that you can't believe today. Young people can't believe whoever existed. But the principal, not being very bright, told him he couldn't wear that in school and to go home and change. And he refused to do it. And that was like the spark that just set up this student rebellion. And the kids just got worked up. And I do know that other principals, superintendent would say privately, what was wrong with that guy? The same thing happened, what happened there at John Hay High School, I think happened at East High about the same time. The difference was, whereas this limited principal at John Hay confronted the kid and stirred up this mess. At East High, the principal just looked at it, considered the atmosphere of the student body and all, and let it go. That's all right. But anyway, the kids rebuilt, and they had kind of a uprising, a rioting in the school. The school was closed. This was, I think, in November or something, early
November
December.
'68 and
Yeah.
February '69.
They weren't able to get the school reopened until after the holiday break to the next year. But yeah, it was a very. I went there on the as soon as we got word at the call post that this uprising was going on at John Hay, a few blocks away. And so I rushed to the school, and I had a camera around my neck when I went in. And I remember this big white detective came to me and, "Get out of here. You can't come in here with that camera." And I said, "What?" You know, I mean, the way he talked to me, I kind of bristled unprofessionally. And he was very belligerent with me, talking down. I didn't know where this was going to end. I didn't know if I was going to be arrested or what. But a black policeman, a black detective, whom I happened to have known slightly, he happened to walk up, and he put his hand on me and said, "Come here." And he just told the white detective, "You know, I'll take care of this." He walked me into the office, and he asked the clerk in the office to hold my camera until I'm ready to leave. And fine, then I was able to stay in the school and do my reporting and see what happened. That's just kind of an example of the difference the police attitude can make, you know. So anyway, yeah, I don't know what to say about that uprising except it was just a very bad time and damaging, I'm sure, for the young people to miss that much school. I know that while this turmoil was going on in the school, kids were in the halls and police were swarming in the place. I saw 2 or 3 seniors rush into the office, and they said, "We want to transfer. We want to go to college. We want to get out of this school so we can get an education." But that was, of course, nothing could be done for them. I don't know what happened to them, but I presume they went on and got their education and are professionals today. But a lot of people probably were hurt by it. Some people missed school and maybe never got back on track. But that was the attitude, the atmosphere of the community to a large extent back then.